My name is Ernesto, and I never thought I'd hear my own family compare me to trash. Yes, trash, something you use, discard, and forget about. I spent decades believing that the love I gave would be remembered. I worked from sunrise to sunset, carried heavy loads until my back was bent, and gave up my dreams so my children could dream. Every penny that came into the house was transformed into food, clothing, and education. I wanted nothing in return, just their affection. But life sometimes presents us with scenes that seem ripped from a nightmare. One day, surrounded by those I myself created, I heard the words that crushed me inside. "You're worthless. You're no longer any good. Better stay away." They spat out these phrases like someone throwing away something insignificant. And I remained silent, unable to react. I didn't cry out of shame, but inside I felt as if I'd been torn apart. I returned to my room that night, my heart aching. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my own hands. Hands that had once been steady, that had built homes, that had held my children when they were small, now trembled in the face of rejection. I asked myself, could it be that my whole life has been nothing but a lie? And yet something inside me whispered that this wouldn't be the last page of my story. They might have thrown me away like trash, but there was still a value within me that no one could erase. And what would happen next? They could never have imagined. From a young age, I learned that life only rewards those who give their all to work. I grew up poor, in a home where every loaf of bread was divided equally so no one would go hungry. When I was still a boy, I helped my father in the fields, carrying sacks bigger than me. There was no rest, but there was a dream, to raise a family that would never have to experience the same scarcity I knew. And when I got married, I promised myself and my wife, Clara, that my children would have a different life. I fought with all my might to make it so. I worked as a bricklayer, a carpenter, a truck driver. There were days when I left home before sunrise and only returned late at night. Clara was waiting for me with a simple dish, and I smiled even though I was tired, because I knew that effort was for them. I remember when my first child was born. I was still young, but I already carried the weight of responsibility on my chest. I looked at that little being and thought, I will never let you lack anything. Then the others came, and the promise was repeated at each birth. I spent my youth and entire adult life sacrificing my own desires. I never traveled, never bought expensive clothes, never lived for myself. Everything was for them. School, books, birthdays with cake and gifts, even when the money barely covered rice and beans. There were nights when Clara and I ate only coffee and bread for dinner, so that our children could eat better. And I believed that all this sacrifice would be remembered. I believed that, in my old age, I would receive in return the care, the respect, perhaps even the pride of seeing my children say, "This is my father, a man who gave everything for us." But life has a cruel way of showing that love is not always reciprocated. The first signs of ingratitude didn't come like a thunderclap, but like tiny drops that slowly corroded my heart. At first they were loose phrases said jokingly, but they cut me to the core. "Ah, Father, you don't understand these modern things. You've already lived what you had to live, now it's our turn." I smiled to hide the pain, but inside I was starting to feel like I was being pushed out of their lives. Over time, the exclusion became clearer. When they met to decide something important, I wasn't called upon. If I commented on my opinions, they dismissed them as old people's stuff and continued talking as if I weren't there. Even my grandchildren, innocent as they were, would repeat words they'd heard from their parents. "Grandpa is very slow, he doesn't know how to do anything alone." These phrases, though spoken without malice by the children, echoed within me like hammer blows. I, who had once been the strong arm of the family, was now portrayed as a burden, like a piece of furniture forgotten in a corner of the house. One night, I overheard a conversation between my oldest son and his wife. I was lying in bed, the bedroom door ajar, and I clearly heard her say, "Your father is nothing but trouble. He's no longer any good." My heart stopped for a moment. That sentence burned into me like a branding iron. And the worst part wasn't hearing it from my daughter-in-law. It was noticing my son's silence. He didn't defend me. He said nothing. He simply let those poisoned words be accepted as truth. From that day on, something inside me began to die. I still helped where I could. Still tried to smile, but I no longer felt like I belonged. And it was in this forced silence, in this increasingly evident exclusion, that I began to understand. I was slowly being discarded. The humiliations began to become more visible, heavier, even impossible to ignore. Small gestures that, added together, crushed me day after day. One night we were at the dinner table. I always sat in the same corner, silent, happy, just to see the family together. But that night, when I approached, my daughter-in-law placed her hand on my empty plate and said in a low but firm voice, "Not today, Mr. Ernesto. There's not much food." I looked at the plate she was pushing away from me and then at my children's faces. None of them said anything. They just continued serving themselves and the children. I sat silently, swallowed the lump in my throat and said I wasn't hungry. But inside, I felt as if I'd been reduced to nothing, invisible even in the simplest moment, sharing a meal. Another time I offered to help fix the backyard fence. My hands, though aged, remembered holding a hammer well. But my son looked at me disdainfully and said, "Dad, don't interfere. You'll only get in the way." Those words hit me harder than any blow I'd taken in years of hard labor. I, who had built entire houses, who had erected walls with my own hands, was now treated like a nuisance. Even my grandchildren, without realizing it, repeated that look. One day, playing in the backyard, I heard one of them say, "Grandpa doesn't do anything. He just sits there like a piece of forgotten trash." The child's innocent laughter pierced me like a spear. I didn't blame the boy, but rather the example he'd received from his parents. After all, children repeat what they learn at home. At that moment, I realized I was no longer just forgotten. I was being pushed to the lowest place in the family, the place of inconvenience, uselessness, and expendability. And every time I closed my bedroom door, I felt the weight of those words accumulating. It was as if someone had erased my entire history and reduced me to nothing but old age, silence, and shadow. The trigger came on a Sunday afternoon. The family was gathered in the backyard for a barbecue. I watched from afar, sitting in an antique chair, content simply to watch my grandchildren running and playing. The smell of roasting meat brought back memories of the times when I myself would light the fire, chop the wood, and proudly serve my children. I decided to approach slowly, smiling just to offer help. I said, "I can tend the fire if you like." Before I could finish my sentence, my daughter-in-law blurted out, without bothering to lower her voice, "Forget it. He's just a nuisance. Better he stay quiet in the corner." Some of their laughter echoed like stab wounds. I tried to hide the pain, but at that moment, one of my sons added, looking at me with a mixture of impatience and coldness, "Dad, you've already done your part. Now you're just giving us trouble. It's best not to interfere." I froze. I looked around, searching for a look of compassion, someone to defend me, but I found none. Only faces averted their eyes, as if trying to avoid the weight of the scene. It was then that I heard the words I never thought I would hear from a son's mouth. "To tell you the truth, Father, you're worthless anymore." I felt the world spin around me. My breathing grew heavy and my hands began to tremble. Those words weren't just cruel. They erased in one fell swoop my entire life, all my sacrifices, all the dreams I'd buried so they could live theirs. My grandchildren, without understanding, laughed and played. But inside me, a part broke. I was no longer seen as a father, a grandfather, or a man. I was treated like trash, a used and discarded object. I got up without saying a word. I walked back to my room, each step heavier than the last. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at my calloused hands and thought, these hands built everything, and now they say they are worthless. In that silence, the pain was so deep that it seemed like it couldn't fit inside me. That night was one of the longest of my life. I closed the bedroom door, but it seemed the weight of the words kept seeping through the cracks. The sound of laughter in the backyard, the clink of glasses, the music playing, all of it reached me as a cruel contrast to the silence inside my heart. I sat on the bed alone, staring at the bare walls. The tears came uncontrollably. It wasn't just pain. It was the feeling of being erased from the very story I'd constructed. I looked at my hands that had once been steady, that had built walls, that had held children. that had worked from sunrise to sunset to put bread on the table. Now they trembled, fragile, as if bearing the weight of all the rejection I had just heard. I thought about the years of sacrifice, the days I came home exhausted, but still smiled so as not to worry Clara, the months I sold my things to pay for my children's school fees, the times I starved in silence so they never had to feel the emptiness in their stomachs. And now, all of this was treated as if it didn't matter. You are worthless anymore. Those words echoed like a hammer in my head. I closed my eyes and let the darkness envelop me. My heart ached as if it had been ripped from my chest. I had never felt so invisible, so alone. It wasn't just the absence of company, it was the absence of worth. As if I had already been discarded and forgotten. It was at that moment, deep in the pit of my grief, that a spark ignited. A memory of Clara's voice, my wife, when she was still alive. She always said, "Ernesto, no matter how much the world turns its back, God will never abandon you." Those words echoed within me like a thread of light in the darkness. I didn't yet understand how, but I knew my story couldn't end there. And even with tears in my eyes, I whispered in the silence of the room, "Lord, if there is still any purpose for me, show me." It was the first step. I didn't know it, but that was the beginning of preparation for something that would change everything. The next morning, I woke up with my eyes still swollen from the night before. The weight of the words I'd heard still throbbed in my mind, but something inside me was no longer the same. That memory of Clara's voice, "God will never abandon you," echoed inside my chest like a reminder. If I was still breathing, it was because my story wasn't over. I got up slowly, washed my face, and sat at the table with a pen and an old notebook I found at the bottom of the drawer. I looked at the blank page and thought, if they don't recognize who I was, I'll write it myself. I'll record my life so that no one can erase what I've built. I began to jot down memories one by one. I wrote about the first day I walked onto a construction site as a teenager, carrying bricks bigger than my arms could handle. I wrote about buying my son his first pair of shoes after weeks of tireless work. I wrote about the nights Claire and I ate only bread and coffee for dinner, so there would be meat left over for the children. Each memory I wrote was like a brick restoring strength to my soul. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was proof that my life had meaning. After hours of writing, I closed the notebook and felt something strange. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel empty. It was as if, by recording my own story, I was reclaiming pieces of myself that they had tried to erase. I also decided to organize old documents and photos. Pay stubs, birthday photos, letters Clara had left me. All of that became my silent treasure, my weapon against oblivion. As I put these papers away in a worn blue folder, I looked out the window at the sky and whispered, "Sir, if I get the chance, I will show them who I really was. Not for revenge, but for the truth to be seen." From that day on, I was no longer just the old reject. I was preparing myself. The following days were different. I no longer spent my time simply sitting silently in my room. Now each morning was dedicated to writing, organizing, and remembering. It was as if I were rebuilding my life on paper, piece by piece, brick by brick. I wrote calmly but also with tears. I remembered the day my daughter got sick and I had to sell my tools to pay for medicine. I remembered the month I worked 3 shifts in a row, barely sleeping, so I wouldn't miss anything for Joan's birthday. I also noted the nights Clara would hold my hand and say, "One day they will see the father they have." Each memory made me more certain that I needed to speak, but simply having documents and memories wasn't enough. I needed to find the right words. I didn't want my voice to sound like resentment, but like truth. That's how I started rehearsing. Sometimes at night, alone in my room, I would speak quietly, as if I were in front of them. "You say I'm worthless, but it was my hands that built the life you enjoy today. You called me trash, but I was the foundation of this family." I repeated these phrases until my voice became firm. I didn't want to shout. I didn't want to be angry. I wanted clarity. I wanted each word to be impossible to ignore. Over time, I realized that this rehearsal also strengthened me internally. It was as if I was training not only my speech, but also my heart. And with each repetition, I was reminded again that my life wasn't a mistake. One night, after practicing in front of the mirror, I looked at my reflection. Aged, tired, but standing tall. And I said to myself, they will hear. They will know who I am. And in that moment, I realized it was no longer just a wish. It was a plan. The day would come. After filling pages and pages of my notebook with memories, I realized something was still missing. It wasn't enough to just record it for myself. If I ever wanted my children to face the truth, I needed to speak directly to them, even if it was in writing. It was then that I began writing personal letters, one for each child. The first was for John, the oldest. I wrote, "Son, you were the first to hold my finger with your little hands. I worked day and night because I wanted you to be proud of me. Do you remember your first school uniform? I bought it after working a whole month without a day off. Today, when I hear you say I'm useless, I remember that boy with his eyes shining with joy. And I wonder where the recognition went." Carefully folding the letter, I felt the tears well up. It wasn't revenge. It was pain, transformed into words. Then I wrote to my daughter, Anna, "Daughter, I'll never forget the blue dress you wanted so much for the school dance. I sold the only bicycle I owned to buy that dress. Seeing your smile was worth more than any pedal stroke. Today, when you look away from me, I don't just feel forgotten. I feel as if I've been ripped from your heart." And so I wrote one by one. Each letter was like a piece of my soul delivered to paper. I knew they might not accept reading it. They might tear it up in front of me. But I needed to leave it on record so they could never say they didn't know. That night, I put all the letters in the blue folder along with the receipts, old photos, and the notebook. I touched the worn cover and murmured, "Here is my story, and on the right day you will have to look at it." I lay down that night exhausted but with a new feeling. I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing. The letters were already written, folded, and carefully stored in the blue folder. The black notebook filled with notes was now like a diary of my life. But even with all this prepared, I knew the hardest part was still missing: the courage to speak in front of them. For years I had learned to swallow my words, to keep quiet so as not to disturb, to smile even when it hurt. But this time would be different. I couldn't let my story end marked only by silence and pain. It was then that I began to seek strength from the only source I had left. At night, before going to sleep, I would kneel beside my bed and pray quietly, "Lord, I do not want my words to be filled with hate. Give me wisdom so that when the time comes I may speak the truth firmly but also with dignity." There were nights when exhaustion made me fall asleep on my knees. Other nights I just cried silently, feeling a weight lift from my chest. But with each prayer, I felt something shift inside me. I no longer felt only resentment. I began to feel that it all had a purpose. I began to rehearse not only in front of the mirror, but in front of God. I spoke as if I were already in front of them. "You called me trash, but I'm not disposable. I was the foundation of this family, and you need to remember that." I repeated it until my voice was firm, without trembling. And with each repetition, the fear diminished. One afternoon, sitting on the porch, the cold wind blowing on my face, I made a decision. The next family gathering would be the day. There would be no more silence, no more running away. I would show who I was, and they would have to listen. I closed the blue folder, placed it on my lap, and murmured, "Clara, my dear, if you can see me, know this. They will know the truth. I will not let the sacrifice of a lifetime be treated as nothing." And in that moment I was sure. The confrontation was near. The following days were spent waiting and reflecting. I had everything ready. The notebook full of memories, the handwritten personal letters, the old documents, and the photographs that testified to my story. Now all that was left was to decide on the right moment. That's when my daughter called, inviting me to family lunch the following Sunday. Her voice sounded casual, as if it were just another gathering. But to me, those words felt like a summons. I understood immediately. That was where everything would happen. On Saturday night, I placed the blue folder on my desk and opened it one last time. I reviewed every detail. I ran my fingers over the yellowed photos, read excerpts from the letters again, and leafed through the notebook. Each page brought back memories of pain and sacrifice, but also reminded me of the strength that still remained within me. As I closed the folder, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. The fear of being ignored once again, the determination not to allow my life to be buried in oblivion. That night I knelt down by my bed once more and prayed, Lord, tomorrow I don't just want to talk. I want my words to be seeds that break hardened hearts. Don't let me tremble. Don't let me be silent. The next day I put on my best shirt, the one I saved for special occasions. I looked in the mirror and, for a moment, saw not just the old reject, but the man who had built a lifetime of hard work and love. I picked up the blue folder, held it tightly against my chest and murmured, now they will listen. Now the truth will be on the table. And with firm steps, I walked towards the encounter that would change everything. Sunday dawned differently. The sky was overcast, as if the weather itself reflected the weight I carried in my heart. I left home earlier than usual, clutching the blue briefcase tightly to my chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, but within me I was certain there would be no turning back. When I arrived at my daughter's house, the atmosphere was already filled with voices and laughter. Children ran around the yard. The smell of roasting meat filled the air, and for a moment I almost felt part of it all again. But the memory of the cruel words I had heard, "You are worthless," echoed as a reminder that he wasn't there to pretend nothing had happened. I greeted everyone with a small smile, but my serious look betrayed something was coming. Some noticed. My son João asked, "Dad, is everything okay? You seem different today." I just replied, "Today, yes. Today you will listen to me." I sat at the table in silence, watching every face. The conversation continued normally. Jokes, travel plans, work-related discussions. I remained quiet, my briefcase resting on my knees. My heart pounded like a drum announcing war. When everyone was served and the sound of silverware filled the room, I placed the folder on the table. The sound of the metal clasp opening cut through the conversation like a blade. Everyone looked at me in surprise. I took a deep breath, looked at each of them and said, "You always thought I'd stay silent, that the old man had no more voice, no more strength. But today, in front of everyone, I'm going to tell the truth you tried to bury with me." Silence filled the room. Even the children on the other side of the house seemed to have stopped playing. And I knew. This was the moment my entire life would be laid out on the table. I opened the folder calmly, feeling the weight of every gaze upon me. I took out the black notebook first, the one I had filled with my own story. I placed it in the center of the table and slowly pushed it forward, as if presenting incontrovertible evidence. "Here is the life you forgot," he said firmly. "Every page tells of a sacrifice, of a sleepless night, of a choice made so that you would never go through what I went through." I flipped through a few pages, reading aloud passages written in my shaky handwriting. I sold my bike to buy Anna's blue dress. I worked until my hands bled to pay for João's school uniform. I spent whole nights keeping watch so that Clara could rest. I looked up and stared at my children. They stood motionless, unresponsive, as if the words were stones thrown at their chests. "You called me useless," I continued, "but it was these hands that raised the roof over your heads. You called me trash, but it was this man who gave you the life you have today." I then took the letters carefully folded and placed them on the table. I wrote one for each of you, not with hate, but with truth. If you have the courage, read it. If not, save it and burn it. But know this, each word is a memory you tried to erase. The silence was so profound that even the crackling of the embers in the backyard barbecue seemed distant. My daughter-in-law lowered her eyes, embarrassed. Anna clutched her napkin tightly, her fingers trembling. João breathed heavily, avoiding my gaze. I brought my hands closer to the notebook and said in a firm tone, "You thought I would grow old in silence, swallowing the humiliations. But not today. Today you will have to face what you pretended to forget." And I turned the page to the most painful memory, ready to expose it to everyone. I turned the notebook to the page where my handwriting was most pronounced. As if the pain had pressed the pen even harder against the paper, I took a deep breath and read aloud, "Sunday family barbecue. Everyone laughing, everyone eating. The table was full. I sat in the corner, without a plate, without an invitation. I heard them say, 'Leave him alone, he's no good anymore.' That day I swallowed the humiliation like it was bitter food. I went back to my room, and the sound of laughter outside was proof that I no longer belonged there. I closed the notebook slowly and looked at them. The silence was heavy. João lowered his head, His shoulders hunched. Anna had tears in her eyes, but she couldn't say anything. My daughter-in-law bit her lip, as if she wanted to disappear. "Do you remember that day?" I asked, my voice steady even as my heart raced. "Because I do. I remember every detail. I remember every word. You left me sitting like a stranger in my own family." No one answered. The silence was confirmation that I already knew. I, Ernesto, your father, didn't deserve a plate of food? Didn't deserve a seat at the table I helped build? My voice rose, not in a shout, but in authority. "You called me trash, but trash doesn't build. Trash doesn't sacrifice. I'm a man. I'm a father. And I demand that you look me in the eye and tell me if this is justice." I looked at João, who still didn't dare to look at me. "You, son. Remember? You were there. You heard. You were silent. Why?" He took a deep breath, his voice choked. "I remember, father. And I also remember the shame I felt afterwards. But the cowardice was greater. Tears came to my eyes, but I didn't let my voice waver. So today, in front of everyone, there will be no silence. Today the truth cannot be ignored." And I slammed my open hand on the notebook as if sealing a sentence. The impact of my words hung in the air like a storm about to break. The closed notebook before me felt like a sacred weight, as if it contained not only memories but also the proof of my worth. I looked up and stared into every face around the table. "I will not accept silence today," he said firmly. "I want to hear from each of you. I want you to tell me, looking me in the eye. Was it fair?" I pointed at João. He was motionless, but his heavy breathing betrayed the turmoil inside. With effort, he lifted his head and looked at me. "No, father," he said hoarsely. "It wasn't fair. I knew it was wrong, but I kept quiet. And that silence haunts me to this day." Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't just from pain. There was also a strange sense of relief, as if each confession were a brick falling from my shoulders. I turned to Anna. She was already crying, the napkin crumpled between her hands. "Dad," he stammered, "I failed too. How many times have I passed your door and thought about calling out to you? But I chose to pretend I didn't see you. I'm ashamed of that." My grandchildren looked on in alarm, not fully understanding, but realizing something important was happening. I then pointed to my daughter-in-law, who kept her eyes fixed on the table. "And you?" I asked. "You who so often opened your mouth to belittle me. What do you have to say now?" She took a deep breath, swallowed hard, and replied in a trembling voice. I was cruel. I used words I never should have said. I treated you like a nuisance, when I should have treated you like an example. I have no excuse." The room was plunged into tears and heavy silence. I looked at them one by one and said, "Today you can no longer pretend. Today you have acknowledged it. And this truth will remain between us forever." I placed my hand on the notebook and completed. "But something is still missing. What I have stored inside, and what you don't know yet, is missing." The silence that fell after the confessions felt almost sacred. Every face around me was marked by shame, tears, or the weight of what had finally been exposed. I could feel the heavy breathing in the room, as if everyone was waiting for the final blow, the sentence I would deliver after all. I placed my hand on the notebook, took a deep breath and said, "You thought that by calling me trash you had buried my dignity. But you're wrong. Trash doesn't build homes. Trash doesn't raise children. Trash doesn't sacrifice itself. I'm not trash. I'm Ernesto. I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. I'm the man who carried this family on his back when you had nothing." I stood up with difficulty but firmly, resting my hands on the table. Everyone's eyes followed me. Today you heard the truth. Today every word was spoken in the face of those who tried to silence it. But know this, you have not heard everything yet. I opened the folder and took out the last letter, the one with no specific addressee, but which I had written as a final testimony. I held it up before them and said, "In this letter, I wrote not only about my pain, but also about the choice I made. You rejected me, humiliated me, treated me like nothing. But I discovered something you didn't expect. There is a value in me that no one can erase because it doesn't come from you." My children looked at each other, confused. I continued, "The real twist in my story isn't the weight of the pain I carry, but what I found in the midst of it. Something you'll see very soon. I closed the letter, sat back in my chair, and looked at everyone intently. What will happen next? You could never imagine. And I let the silence speak for me, leaving each of them stuck with the question that had no answer. That same day, after everything was said and all the tears were shed, I returned to my room with the blue folder still clutched to my chest. I could have felt only revenge. I could have gone to bed satisfied that I had exposed every wound to them. But to my surprise, that was not what happened. I sat on the bed and remained silent, looking at my own hands. Hands scarred, calloused, wrinkled, but still trembling, not with anger but with something else. Something I didn't fully understand. The pain was there, yes, but there was also an unexpected calm, as if a gentle voice were telling me, now it's time to let me take care of this. I closed my eyes and remembered Clara. I remembered the times she would tell me, when life was too hard, Ernesto, don't put on your shoulders a weight that only God can carry. Those words resonated deeply. I had spent decades trying to be the foundation of my family, carrying it alone, believing my worth came only from what I did for them. But then, I realized there was something greater, something that sustained my life even when everyone else had rejected me. I bent my knees right there with difficulty and said a prayer that was not rehearsed but came from the depths of my soul. Jesus. I was treated like trash by my own children. I was called nothing, forgotten, cast aside. But I know that in your eyes I am not disposable. Enter into my pain and transform what is left of me. As he spoke, a peace filled the room. There was no light, no music, nothing extraordinary, just a gentle warmth that filled my chest and brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in years, I cried not just from pain but from relief. I understood that true value did not come from the recognition of my family, but from the gaze of God, who was always upon me. The next morning, I opened my eyes and noticed something different. The weight that had been with me for weeks, that tightness in my chest, that feeling of invisibility, seemed to have lifted. The room was the same, my body still tired, but inside me there was a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. I got up slowly, washed my face and stared at myself in the mirror. The man before me still had deep wrinkles, gray hair, and the marks of a lifetime of struggle. But his eyes had a glow I hadn't seen since Clara was still alive. It was as if, after so long being dim, they were once again reflecting life. As I drank coffee, I opened the black notebook again. I reviewed some pages, rereading memories written on tearful nights. But now, as I leafed through them, I realized something new. Those memories weren't just testimonies of pain, they were also proof of resilience. Every sacrifice, every choice, every renunciation made over the years showed that I had fulfilled my role, and I realized that their ingratitude didn't erase the value of what I had done. What sustains a man is not the approval of others, but the presence of God, I murmured, repeating the words that came to my heart. In that moment, I understood that my struggle wasn't just against my family's contempt. The real battle was against the resentment that wanted to take hold within me, and I wouldn't let it win. I decided then that my response to everything they had done would not be hatred, but something greater, forgiveness. Not because it was easy, nor because they deserved it, but because I had experienced God's grace the night before. And that grace told me it was time to let go of the burden and move forward with a free heart. With that decision, my view of my own family began to change. I no longer saw them simply as tormentors of my pain, but as lost people, as flawed as I was, who needed the same grace that now sustained me. That following Sunday, the family gathered again. The weight of the confrontation still lingered in the air, and I noticed in everyone's eyes a certain fear of what was to come. Perhaps they thought I would return to exact more, to rub the pain even more in their faces. But this time, something different was inside me. When I arrived, everyone was sitting silently as if awaiting judgment. I placed the blue folder on the table but didn't open it. I stood for a few seconds, observing each of them in turn until I finally spoke. Last week, you heard the truth. You heard how much it hurt me to be treated like nothing, like trash. And today I could repeat it all. I could use my words like stones, but I won't. Their expressions became tense, as if they didn't understand what I meant. I took a deep breath and continued. Because something happened to me. I knelt before God and gave him all the pain I was carrying. And do you know what I received in return? Peace. A peace that didn't come from you, but from Jesus. Tears began to stream down Anna's face. João lowered his head, his eyes brimming with tears. I approached and added, I've decided I won't hold a grudge. I choose to forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I received forgiveness first. A heavy silence fell over the room. My daughter-in-law, who rarely looked me in the eye, discreetly wiped away her tears. One of my grandsons asked softly, Grandpa, even after everything, do you still love them? I smiled with difficulty but sincerely and replied, more than ever, because the love I feel now doesn't come from me alone. It comes from God, who placed a new heart within me. And in that moment I realized that the real impact wasn't exposing their flaws. The real impact was showing that forgiveness is stronger than any rejection. The words hung in the air as if time had stopped. My children stared at me in astonishment, unable to comprehend how, after everything, I could choose forgiveness. That silence that had once been one of shame now became one of astonishment. It was John who broke first. He stood up slowly, his hands trembling, and said in a choked voice, Father, I don't understand how you do it. I would have harbored hatred forever. But if you're capable of forgiving after everything we've done, then I want to change too. Tears streamed down her face, and I saw it wasn't just a passing emotion. It was genuine regret. Anna, who was already crying silently, held my hand and added, I never want to see you alone again. If there's still any chance, I want to rebuild our relationship. Not like before, but in a new way, with more love, with more truth. My daughter-in-law, who had always kept her distance, wiped her eyes and murmured, Mr. Ernesto, I was unfair, harsh, and selfish. I owe you respect, but above all, I owe you care. Forgive me. My grandchildren, without understanding the full depth, hugged me by the legs, repeating, We love you, Grandpa. It was then that I understood. Forgiveness wasn't just healing my heart, it was also beginning to heal theirs. It wasn't just religious words or formal gestures. It was something living, real, that was transforming that home. The peace I'd felt the night before in prayer now seemed to spread throughout the entire room. It was as if an invisible presence had filled the space, breaking chains, tearing down walls, rekindling what had seemed dead. I looked at everyone, with tears and a firm voice, and said, It wasn't me who did this. It was God. He entered into my pain, and now he's entering into yours. And I saw in my family's eyes that that truth could no longer be denied. In that instant, I realized that the room where I had once been humiliated was now the scene of a silent miracle. I, who had been called trash, was at the center of the table again, but not as a burden, but as the pillar that, by God's grace, held that family together. I stood up slowly, still holding Anna and João's hands. I looked at everyone and said, You threw me away like someone discarding something worthless. But what happened next was something you never imagined. God raised me from the dust, showed me that I still have value, and now gives me the strength to forgive. My words weren't spoken in a tone of accusation, but of victory. Because in that moment, I wasn't carrying resentment, but gratitude. Gratitude for being alive, for being able to see that even the cruelest rejection can be transformed into redemption when Jesus enters the story. My daughter-in-law lowered her head, sobbing, while my grandchildren hugged me tightly. João, still teary-eyed, declared, Father, you're not trash. You're the root of this family, and we need to learn to honor you again. I smiled with tears streaming down my face and replied, I don't just want honor. I want you to know the same grace that reached me, because only that can truly heal. The atmosphere, previously filled with pain, was now filled with a peace neither of us could explain. It was then that I understood. The true miracle wasn't having unburdened my pain, but having seen forgiveness open a new path for all of us. Before closing, I looked at each one and left the lesson that summed up my entire life. Remember, the world may call someone nothing, but in the eyes of God, no one is disposable. And so, in that house where I was rejected, a new story was born, not written by ingratitude, but by the power of forgiveness.